the world generally is always in the process of changing, that change is more normal than stability. And the paradox in that statement is that stability comes from a kind of reflexive interweaving of things. The core phrase that I think summarizes the Tao is the path is made through walking. And what it means, and it's quite different to some other spiritual traditions, it means there isn't a way, there isn't a right way, and we just have to get on it and follow it. It's saying the future is co-created by what we do, by our actions and behaviours collectively as we go. If we understand that we are all interconnected, that we can't be safe if you're not safe, we can't be resilient if you're not resilient, it creates that pathway into the importance of our actions, behaviors and intentions. Sometimes in a kind of meditative relational practice, you start to feel compassion. It doesn't become hard to choose, it becomes something that you feel. You awaken the heart through those kind of practices. I think being able to embrace complexity, it requires a kind of bigger perspective. It's kind of looking wider and longer, being able to integrate disparate ideas. It's being able to hold the heart and the mind together. I think love can be in the cracks as well as just some sort of big idea, and can make all the difference. If we can cultivate love, many of the atrocities that we see happening and the selfishnesses would become harder to perpetrate.
Hi, Jean. Thanks for being on Love and Philosophy. It's so nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Nice to be back.
So we have a big subject today, two big subjects, complexity and the Tao of complexity. And I guess just to start, this idea of complexity, there's so many ways to come at that word, so many different ways in science and also just in everyday life. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you see that word, what it means in your work.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, complexity does have its kind of English language usage. If I ask my mum what complexity would mean, she would say some of the things that I would say from a more scientific perspective about it's things that are interwoven, that it creates a level of uncertainty and a sense that things can change. So I think the core aspects of complexity, from my point of view, would be this idea of diversity of things that are and things interacting. So things relationally interwoven, interacting, they're diverse, the connections can shift and change, and the whole thing is open to its wider context. So it's not like a clock, where in a sense we imagine that there's very little interaction with the wider world. It's something that can change, that can morph, but remains in this kind of interwoven way. So a family, for example, would be a small example of an open, complex system of interwoven relational people who are all different, interacting in different ways. So the science of complexity studies those kind of situations and comes up with some common views that help us navigate that. So we're not just saying to people it's complex, get over it. We're saying that the science of complexity can help us understand the nature, how that scientific view turns up in practice, what complexity looks like in practice.
Wonderful. And do you see this in contrast to other kinds of science, or do you just see this as one way or path, or how do you see it?
What people think of science, from coming from physics, is about certainty, usually, not always, but usually often linearity, the sense that things can work like a machine. So if we understand how things start, we can understand we can predict how they're going to develop. So that science, that mechanistic worldview, is associated with the work of Isaac Newton from the 17th century. He was interested in how planets go around each other and how two billiard balls bang into each other. But that scientific worldview got translated into the social and the natural world. And we start to think that to be scientific, to be professional in the social world, in management, that's what we should, be doing. We should behave as if the organization or the market can be understood in predictable ways, and we can decide what to do. So complexity is not saying we know nothing, but it's caveating this idea that things are very determined. There's also the view that came from the science of gases and liquids, that the economists have always been very attracted to. And this is the idea that an economy reaches equilibrium naturally and doesn't venture very far from that. So the economists took the maths of what's called equilibrium thermodynamics, the science of liquids and gases. The management took the science of Newton, and in a sense complexity science, which came from a marriage of looking at the physics of open systems coupled with looking at evolution. So it was kind of where physics met biology, gives us a much more organic, natural, flowing, shifting view of the social and natural world that seems much more like we experience in our world. So if I described that to my mum, she would go, yes, I see that. Whereas if I told her the world went to plan, or the world always reached balance, she would look at me rather questioningly.
That's a good way to say it. Speaking of your mom, what did she think when you told her you wanted to be a physicist? Because you are a physicist, right? Or you're trained in physics.
I did, yes. My initial work and research was as a physicist. Well, I think they were ambitious for me, my parents, and they were thrilled I was going to university, and I don't think they minded too much what I did, and it sounded good, so that was enough. I think that was enough for them. It was my father still didn't think I was capable of changing a plug, an electric plug. Even when I was in second year at university, he would still come along and say, "No, I'll do that for you." But
Well,
they were proud. They were proud of me, but they were, yes, they were just proud I'd gone ahead in gone to university and done something difficult.
yes. Well, and fathers like to feel important, so yeah,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah,
they are important. But yes, it does sound very, doctor, lawyer, physicist. It fits in with the
it does. Yes, it did. It ticked the box. But
yes.
it was, I think I was probably, I preferred theory to practice. So I never really was very interested or very good at anything to do with soldering irons or, anything practical. But I became more and more interested in the philosophy of science and the kind of theory. So my PhD was in quantum physics, which obviously is scientific, but it does kind of challenge your worldview. It does sort of shift the way you think about reality. So I think I kind of morphed into having this strong interest in philosophy as time has gone on.
So you were trying to understand the world, trying to understand philosophical ideas from an early age, would you say? Or
Yes, I think from being a teenager, I was always one of these yes, but why kind of kids, as opposed to yes, but what. So I would randomly pick up books on philosophy or Buddhism or indeed Daoism from an early age. And I think that what really interested me about quantum physics is it does rattle the cage of the idea of what is real, what is certain. And I liked all that. I liked this sort of almost I would always wonder, well, why is science and spirituality split? Does it have to be? When did that happen? But if we're interested in the way things work, why wouldn't there be something more mystical and uncertain about it? So those were kind of natural questions for me from being quite young.
I see. So it was exciting to ask those questions, to be a little off unstable, or yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. No, definitely. No, it was, no, my family were generally quite practical, ordinary day-to-day people. So they just sort of regarded me with wonder, I think, as I sort of seem to have this going on in my head and have these other ideas and interests. But
Yeah.
looking back on it, it was a very formative time, and my life has kind of woven many of those threads back together again as time has gone on.
Yeah, it must have been fascinating for them to see their daughter asking these big questions that it sounds like they weren't asking, at least not out loud.
No, I think they were more living an ordinary life. So my mother saw showed her a video of me talking probably 20 years ago, and she was absolutely gobsmacked by the whole thing, seeing me as her daughter who, worrying about my hair, or, when we were going shopping. And she was just absolutely, she watched the whole thing with absolute rapt attention. And all she could say was, how do you know these things?
Oh, wow.
It was rather, yes, so we're all formed by these myriad. We might talk about it later, but I think the idea of love in the world also came from my parents. So they might not have been very educated or gone to university, but their values really imbued my life quite strongly.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about love. And you also mentioned this word Taoism, though. So maybe we should think about that a bit because your book is called The Tao of Complexity.
Yes.
And that can seem like quite a jump from complexity to Taoism. So I don't know if you want to try to explain that through your life or through your
Yes,
book, or it's, yeah.
sure. Well, the emphasis that I've placed on complexity in this book is what I've called process complexity. And it's really emphasizing, and something that came from the work of Ilya Prigogine, who was one of the founding thinkers in this field of complexity. And his first book, or one of his early books, was called From Being to Becoming. And the point he was making was that the world generally is always in the process of changing, that change is more normal than stability. And the paradox in that statement is that stability comes from a kind of reflexive interweaving of things. So for example, if you were to say this family is stable, you would be meaning that the patterns of relationships had some give in them and adaptability, but there was enough commonality of relationship and behavior that it created a kind of resilience and stability. So his interest, and one of the core words for process complexity, is patterning. This idea that things emerge, stabilize, and then dissolve. And the patterning in an economy, the norms of how or the patterning in a culture, the norms of behavior, the norms of relationships, kind of come into being and stabilize through a repetition, but not an exact repetition, but a kind of ability to adapt. The same in an ecology. Why has this wood got these species interacting, and this wood's got a completely different set of species? So this idea of a flow, not a flow meaning everything just keeps changing all the time and we don't know what's going to happen next, but something where we understand that stability is created by reflexive movement, by reflexive repeating, but not exact repeating.
Mm.
So that's the kind of ideas that you get in the worldview of complexity. Also, stuff about the importance of things developing bottom up, or things being local, things being historically shaped. So again, if you think about a family, why does this family behave this way? Well, partly it's to do with the past, what's happened in the past, who's in the family, and it's partly to do with the context. Is this family living in a war? Has somebody just lost their job? So it's understanding that contextual and historically shaped nature of things. So those are the ideas within process complexity. And Daoism, my colleague Peter Allen, with whom I wrote the first book, Embracing Complexity, in 2015, came back to where we were working in, I think, 2003 or 2006, clutching a copy of the Tao Te Ching, this text from the 5th century BC, saying, golly, I've just picked this book up by chance in a secondhand bookshop, and it reads like a complexity theory textbook. And I was entranced, partly because I knew about Taoism and it was something I was interested in. And this particular version of the Tao Te Ching, this particular translation by a couple of guys called Ames and Hall, had a very long introduction. So it's describing this contextual, path-dependent, historically shaped, paradoxical patterning of stability in the same language. And I thought that was gobsmacking. You know, why could they come up with this in the 5th century BC? And then we go through all this sophisticated science and end up with a very similar worldview. So I studied it and still do. I find it completely entrancing to study. And I guess what the Taoist view adds to the science of complexity is sometimes a nuance. So there are certain things that the Tao would bring out in more detail. So to give you an example, the Tao uses a phrase of paying attention to the beginning of the beginning. So it's saying that the good leader will be still and silent and take in the terrain, take in, you know, the group, the situation. And with that kind of that apprehension of the whole, notice the tiny shifts or changes that may be important. So we'll almost see the beginning before it's a beginning. And that would be something I would say the same in complexity, that we need to understand the current patternings, but we need to pay attention to these tiny shoots of change or these tiny cracks of destruction. So I would say it in the same way, but the poetry of the Tao and the way it describes that creates a nuance for me where I go deeper into my own subject matter. So that's one reason I really like it. The other reason I really like it is that in a way, complexity is a science. It's neutral. It will tell you how the powerful get more powerful, as well as it will tell you how to create a resilient, fair world. You know, it's value neutral in a sense. But the Tao is explicitly about cultivating yourself in order to create a better future. So it embeds the idea of how do we cultivate ourselves? How do I become the best I can be in order to be in relationship with other people, with nature, and with the future? And it embraces these kind of paradoxes, which are, again, within complexity, but it would be easy not to think about it in those terms. So, you know, the Tao would say the end is in the beginning. You know, the complexity person would say, well, the patterning is only as stable as it's resilient. And if it starts to unravel, then, you know, it can soon tip into another form. So this paradox is described very well in Taoism. And I think this idea, and it's kind of links, you know, to love, that there is a paradox in, you know, yes, I want to love and honor myself. Yes, I want to love and honor my community, my family. Yes, I want to be cognizant of what I'm doing now is co-creating the future. But they don't give you simple answers. You know, I've got to move between, well, I think actually for now I'm going to have to say no to my friend's demands because that's too much for me, you know, or you know, I'm going to have to make some short-term decisions. I'm going to have to try and make those with the long-term in mind, but nothing is certain. So it raises these kind of tensions in, if you like, in being good, whatever, you know, however one defines that, and in having compassion, in loving. The core phrase that I think summarizes the Tao is the path is made through walking. And what it means, and it's quite different to some other spiritual traditions. It means there isn't a way, there isn't a right way, and we just have to get on it and follow it. It's saying the future is co-created by what we do, by our actions and behaviours collectively as we go. Now, we're not walking onto an empty path because it's been created by what's happened, you know, in the past. So it's not your fault if you turn up in a war zone. But how you move forward is collectively how we must think about the future. So it places centrally the idea of actions and intentions and purpose. And I think that's very powerful. And I sometimes use the phrase that, for me, I want to seed the future with good ingredients. For me, I'd like a just and fair world. And complexity tells you that a just and fair world is actually more resilient. So it's not just a nice to have. It actually, when societies get very unequal, they become much more brittle and less adaptive and much more likely to collapse. So there is a good reason for balance and diversity, but actually, we all have to think about our own values. And I think that the idea of the path is made through walking says, well, if you care about your great grandchildren, if you care about the future, if you care about people in other parts of the world, we're all interwoven. Climate change is a global issue. Pandemics are a global issue. If we understand that we are all interconnected, that we can't be safe if you're not safe, we can't be resilient if you're not resilient, then it creates that pathway into the importance of our actions, behaviors and intentions.
Indeed, I love that phrase, the path is made by walking. And there's something in Buddhism very similar too,
Yes.
I think, and some
Yeah.
other traditions. And even in 4E philosophy, they use this a lot, and in active philosophy. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, also the path is made by walking, but the path is the landscape, or the path is the earth. And so all of our paths that we're making by walking are that shared space that we are trying to, yeah,
Yeah.
orient in the way you were describing.
Yes, and we're not the only agents as well. It is, that sounds very anthropocentric, and I don't think the Tao meant it that way. It is like we are all, everything is creating the future, but the only bit that I can manage, and this is very Buddhist, and Chan Buddhism, for example, was quite a marriage between Taoism and Buddhism in China. That the focus on the now is really saying, well, whatever happened to me in the past, and the thing that I have agency over now is how do I take my next step? How do I treat you now? Is the bit where I always have agency. And people like Viktor Frankl, for example, in Auschwitz, was saying, even when in some senses, if you're in Auschwitz, you have very little control over how you're treated, but you can always smile. You can always have an attitude of kindness to others. You can always imagine the future. So, even if your only agency is in the minute, you have one crust of bread, I'll share it with you, I'll pat you on the back. There's a sense in which, we, as he would say, we can always embody the agency that we have and not see ourselves too small, I think.
Yes, indeed. And by those focusing on those small acts also makes us bigger. It can just sound sweet, as you were saying before, as, oh, just do the right thing, but actually it's a empowerment of, it's a way of connecting with your own power, or the power beyond you in some way.
Yes, and I write at the end of the book about the Albert Camus, The Plague, and it was picked up by Clive Hamilton, who was writing about climate change denial. And he says that the thing he really liked about The Plague was, there's a plague in a town, everybody's probably going to die. Some people hoard all their food and hold themselves up and try and stay alive as long as possible. Some other people decide to, eat and drink and make merry as much as they can. But the doctor, who understood more than anyone the likelihood that things were going to end badly, kept walking forward with integrity, helping people. And Clive Hamilton calls it active fatalism. And I think there's something in that. You never know. And this is an idea that I think is embedded in complexity and Taoism about emergence, that it might look that it might be not very probable, but there's always a possibility that things can suddenly change on the head of a pin. And, you know, there have been many examples in the world where we really didn't see things coming. And sometimes, you know, things even like the pandemic, you know, which obviously some people saw coming, but it re-engineers the whole of society quite quickly sometimes. So I think there's a paradox in that I might feel quite despairing and I might feel quite tiny, but you know, you never know. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know who'll listen to this. You know, we might inspire somebody who does something differently, who is in a more powerful position. So I think holding that idea that I don't have to see myself as insignificant, that I don't know, but all I do know is that I can behave as well as I can, and sometimes seize the moment, sometimes be brave. You know, there are times when the world presents as an opportunity to perhaps step into a space or be brave.
Absolutely. And I think there's something in there too of not just going with the flow, in the sense of what you think is going to be what everyone else thinks is right. There's something about what you were saying too, where we can feel like we have to choose between what seem like binaries, my path or your path, instead of this paradoxical holding that you're expressing and that's in the Tao. And there's something about attention. You said paying attention a lot. How do you see that? Does that help us learn how to stay in that place where we can feel actually what's authentic to us and make those choices you were talking about? What's the role of attention?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that some people would approach a complexity as an issue of the brain, an issue of thinking. So for some people, and even in the what do they call oh dear, the ESGs, are they call these kind of development goals that are to do with the kind of the emotional world. They put complexity thinking down, and I don't think it's just thinking. You know, that many of the complexity people that I know, who started to handle paradox and subjectivity, you know, if you're going to ask a question like, where are the edges of this pattern in this wood? You know, what is the culture of this organization? These have a sort of subjective quality to them. Is this patient ill? You know, my dentist always used to shake everybody's hand, and I once asked him why he did that, and he said, because I get a real visceral sense of whether this is a frail person or a well person, just from that kind of physical connection. So we use our senses in a variety of ways to know what's going on, to pay attention. And the Chinese use the word Xin, Xin, which means heart mind. They don't differentiate like we tend to do between, you know, what we feel and what we think. So I think that sort of embedded heart mind, intuitive, subjective, sensory view of what's going on is something that I increasingly have see as an important part of an aspect of dealing with the complex world. That the other part of it, I think, is that if we are going to, if we just use our analytical tools, I can say to you, and this is what I think sometimes perhaps differentiates some approaches to systems thinking rather than complexity thinking, is the systems thinker asks more, what is? How do we analyze now? Oh, look, there are these patterns, they're stable. Let's understand how they interact. The complexity person is saying the same, you know, what's here now? We don't need to know everything about everything, but what are the dominant patterns? But also, how do we notice change? So there's something about always noticing that however much I analyze now, it may be that I have to notice that there's an opportunity that wasn't there before, or something's changed in the wider context that I hadn't taken into account, or there's a crack appeared, you know, that's an opportunity. So it forms both an integration of the heart mind or the mind body, and also an integration of the analysis which might have a subjectivity to it, but they kind of saying what is here with this practice of noticing. And just to say one more thing, I think the noticing is also part of how we cultivate ourselves. That if we pay attention to our reactions and our habitual thoughts or our habitual attitudes, it's how we cultivate ourselves. We start to notice our own reactions, our own, behaviors that maybe we're not quite even sure why we did it ourselves. So there's something about noticing that's also a cultivation of ourselves.
That's interesting, because I hear you saying the noticing is the whole body, is the bodily being in the world, which is often not what people mean when they say cognition or thinking or mind. There are a lot of movements toward trying to understand that actually the whole body is, the way that we do all of these activities. But to get to that feeling and that noticing and that bodily presence, is that where the Taoism has helped you, or do you see that as part of the complexity science too? Because I'm still not quite sure how we learn how to pay attention, for example, or we learn how to notice. Is it just by like that process of questioning that you sort of begin to notice the world differently in science, or how would you see that?
Well, I think that the classical complexity science is much more, there's lots of people who do mathematical models of things interacting with other things.
Santa Fe Institute version of it.
Yes, and that has its value. What Prigogine was bringing into it is that in an open situation, when you really embrace, you kind of can't know everything that's going on because there's new things arriving and leaving. There's the devil is in the detail. That there's something beyond mathematics or beyond analysis. And Edgar Morin, who's now a French philosopher who's 102, who wrote a book on complexity and is a wonderful man. He differentiates between what he calls general complexity, which is what I'm talking about, the general interweaving of resilient patterning that nevertheless can tip into new forms, etc., is beyond or before mathematics. It's being in the mud as opposed to mapping the terrain. And many complexity people are analysing the map, and getting more and more sophisticated maps. But what Prigogine would say is there's always something, it may be the absolutely minute things that you can't model because they're not yet there, like the Taoists say, that's actually the thing that's going to kind of create a completely radically different future. And no analysis of now is ever going to pick up those minutiae. So I think that's where I'm trying to move complexity thinking more explicitly. I'm not saying anything I don't think Prigogine would have said, but he didn't say it quite in these terms, but I'm moving it into this more embodied, this more heart mind, everything, in a sense, everything that's there is going to make a difference. So what you feel is going to make a difference to the future just as much as what you think. And if you go to a board meeting, you can analyze it in some kind of logical way in terms of what people said. But if you don't understand how people are relating to each other and what the underlying vibes are, you're never going to help that group make a good strategic decision or understand what's actually happening in the room. So we know this, we don't just analyze our family or expect a social worker to come in and, draw a map of the family. There's something more embodied. And I think people like Brian Goodwin, for example, who was a complexity theorist, who was a biologist, he started to talk in these terms. So I think that's why. And I think for myself, this has been a marriage of my own interest in the spiritual, in values, like my father was a very kind-hearted person, was always, doing, much to my mother's annoyance sometimes, he was always helping other people, but civic-minded. And I've been brought up, I've kind of, it's natural to me to think about society and my local communities and to worry about how I treat people. I'm you know, that kind of thing. So I think that I've got interested in somatic work, you know, in all kinds of work that kind of from very different places. I know you've read the Tao of Complexity. Some of the book is about what I've called ontological resonance. In other words, if you look at brain science, if you look at some of the work people have done on somatic experiencing, if you look at some of the political writers, you find very similar ideas. And I'm not trying to tell you they're all the same, but I'm saying to you in the book, you know, look, golly, isn't this interesting? These very different schools of knowledge, bodies of knowledge, have come up with a very similar worldview. Maybe there's something, you know, interesting here.
Yeah, I think what the book does, because you also talk about art, and there's a lot of things in there, but
Yeah,
over the course of the book, we start to understand the process that is, or the patterning that is similar, which you can't actually put in words, even though you can talk about patterning and process. And you
yeah,
start to show us that we can notice this in many different parts of life. So that's back to that noticing again, and to the Persian, where it almost feels like a practice
yes.
that's being given. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think yes, I take seriously my own so you know, I meditate regularly. I find that that has introduced me to the body, you know, in a way that I didn't know I wasn't embodied, you know, having been brought up to be to have a, you know, a brain and think. It was and sort of that was split off in some ways from the body as I've done various kinds of practices that has become more integrated and I think I've partly through that, partly through various sorts of reflective practice and through, you know, through paying attention and showing up to those things, I have tried to hone myself, to kind of mature myself. And I don't think that happens. You know, I think it is a practice. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear how you came into understanding yourself as a body, not just stuck in your head, if you felt like sharing it.
Yes. Well, I think in a variety of ways, but there is a particular Tibetan Buddhist field of practice called Kumye. A Tibetan leader came to California in the 60s and joined in some of the kind of, you know, the body work that was going along there. And he kind of emphasized, he realized how disembodied the people in the West were. And he developed a series of exercises which are called Tibetan yoga, which are very slow and precise and are ways of really almost like introducing us into how the body feels and how that changes our cognition or our seeing. You know, so it might be about how you start to tune in to seeing the world in a more panoramic way, you know, rather than kind of focusing, you know, in a very kind of definitive way that we often get taught to do. And you have little breakthroughs with things like that, and you think, oh my goodness, you know, I never realized that if I sat here quietly, I could take in this whole vista of the landscape, and the bird song suddenly becomes, you know, brighter. You know, I was too busy thinking about, you know, what I was going to do next. So you have these little breakthroughs, and then you get interested to do more and to take it further and to pay it more attention. And I think it's the same with compassion, that, you know, compassion is an idea. You know, well, I should, you know, I could convince you fairly easily that you should think about others, you know, and it would be good to be caring, and everybody would nod and say, yes, that's true. But sometimes in a kind of relational practice, in a kind of meditative relational practice, you start to feel compassion. It doesn't become hard to choose. It becomes something that you feel. It
Mm,
sort of, you awaken the heart through those kind
mm.
of practices. And then that changes everything. You don't forget that. You forget it temporarily, but you have something to go back to. And you know, some of the writing, for example, of Brian Goodwin writing about health. as, how does the doctor really work out your health issues? Well, partly, it's not to deny analysis and logic and data, but it's just sometimes how you weave those different perspectives together. The questions you ask, how the person feels, is as important as just, what their heart rate is and what their this is and what their that is. You're building up a much more complex picture of the person in which those facts are embedded, but they're not the only thing that's driving your sense of what this person needs and their wellness.
Yeah, I want to ask you about feeling and about, because I'm trying to imagine you as a little girl. I have a few times because you've talked about your parents, and it sounds
Yeah.
like you had a very stable, loving, safe environment, even to the extent that you were sort of looking, doing some edge work or looking for the instability or realizing the instability and trying to understand it. I want to hear about that a little bit and how you've journeyed, what path you've been walking in terms of feeling, not only coming into your body, but also with studying physics, the complexity science, the path that you've gone on that led into embracing complexity and then the Tao of complexity. What's feeling been like in all of that? Have you been on a journey in terms of your exploration of what feeling is for you and how you connect with others?
Yes. Golly. All childhoods have wounds and traumas of various sorts. Some people perhaps don't, but most people do. And my parents were quite strict, so they had kind of quite black and white ideas about things and what they did if you didn't adhere to them. So as a kind of very lively questioning child, that it wasn't always straightforward. There were traumas in that, and I guess the truth is it's your woundedness, it's your awkwardnesses and your difficulties that that shape who you become. They either get embedded, and people say, well, nobody changes, what can you do? Or if you're a kind of determined kind of person, I think I always go digging, whether it's quantum physics or me, it's like, why am I reacting this way, or why do I feel like this? So I think it is a path of healing woundedness and understanding that, both individually and societally. A book that had a lot of impact on me a long time ago is a book called When Society Becomes an Addict. And it was a description of a society that starts to feel, oh, well, I don't know very much, that man in charge, he must know what he's doing, I'll leave it all to him, he can be the big daddy, and I'll just kind of hope it all works out okay, because who am I to question it? And it's a sort of addictive response to a father figure that lets you off the hook and allows you to play. And then if that get perpetrated into, well, to be a good citizen, you must be a good consumer, spend, be selfish. You start to create a society of selfish people who kind of, or you tell them, well, inequality, they all had the opportunity, it's your fault if you're poor, the opportunity was there. There's all sorts of messages societies give people. And you get a toxic society that perpetrates these kind of ideas, that men are both selfish and not selfish. If you have a society which tells you to be selfish, rewards you to be selfish, or you will become more selfish, as opposed to the opposite. So I think both societally and personally, it's often loss, wounds, difficulties, that are what shapes us if we face up to it. And that's certainly without going into gory detail, that's been part of my journey, and and quite difficult things to deal with sometimes, that have taken a lot of facing up to, but have kind of then are transformative if you're lucky, and if you face it, and with help sometimes.
Makes me think of the work of Joanna Macy, and I know you
Yeah.
know her and like her work, or influenced by her work as well. And what you were saying about the society, I hadn't thought of it so much, that these are kind of wounds that we take on, that we even becoming addicted to buying things, or addicted to trying to look better, or addicted to having more follows and all of this. There's something when that's happening to us that we know something is wrong about it, and it
Mm.
becomes hard to hold the space that you were opening up in the beginning, where we can see that we can surf it and maybe find another path.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that does kind of become almost like wounds. And just to go back to Joanna Macy, her work is about sort of sitting with that, right? Or
Yeah.
feeling that. Has that been part of your practice?
Yes. I mean, Joanna is one of the people I really admire in the world. It would be somebody and I think to take this path, is to be able to cope with being an outsider and being different. And I think you need people, be it through literature or in real life, and Joanna's a bit of both. I've spent a week with her a couple of years ago, and I've met her before. But you need people who help you help hold you in these difficult spaces. And I'm also trying to hold this space, which I think is unusual, is you can't just put me in the kind of cuddly feely box, because I'm marrying, I can do theoretical physics. I'm marrying, the analysis and the feeling. I'm not saying let's forget about the feeling. Brian Goodwin, he was a very good mathematician. He was a computational biologist, and he married the two. He and Goethe, these big thinkers. Joanna Macy's PhD is in looking at the relationship between Buddhism and systems thinking, and it's a beautiful piece of work. Has a sharp brain, but
Mm-hmm.
she's embodied a heartful way of engaging with the world. She has a masterful intellect. It's a very, very good piece of work, but it was always married with her views of compassion uh, and feeling about the future. And she always married the two. And she is somebody, as you say, that I have always looked up to, and being with her brings tears to your eyes somehow. There's something about how she embodies love, really, at the same time as having a mind, as sharp as a tack. She's perhaps showing she's not getting any younger, but that mixture, that integration, as the Chinese have it, of heart mind, is has been a kind of split, that's happened more in the West since this idea of, science is about facts and logic, and then the rest of it sort of something to do with spirituality and religion. And one of the themes I write about in the book is how, in a variety of ways, quantum physics opens the door to mysticism again. There's a, as one of my colleagues who was a mathematical physicist said, there's almost like there's cracks. The universe has got cracks in it. You can never build it up out of building blocks. It's a bit like a badly made piece of furniture that never quite fits together. And as Leonard Cohen said, I love this quote, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. So there's a sort of reintegration of heart, mind, of science and spirituality that I think is very interesting. But it doesn't make those people who are transcending that into people who suddenly give up on logic or data or analysis. It's more about of a marriage, of marrying the two.
Yes, I really appreciate that you do that with the book, and that you say that now, because I think there is a kind of, there's almost like a reaction if you hear certain words or certain phrases, or even Taoism.
Yes.
You sort of some people, without necessarily meaning to, categorize it in a way that would be somehow considered opposite of science.
Yes.
And yeah, holding paradox in the way we've been talking about is
Yeah.
opening a space for both of those, which is what you're doing, right?
Yes, and what I'm trying to say is not that Daoism is science, but that the the worldview, the metaphysics of complexity theory, and the worldview, the cosmology of Taoism, hold a very similar view of the way the world works. Now, science is often about how do you find out about things. So there are two aspects of science. One of them is what is the world like? That's an ontological stance. And the complexity view of science that comes from physics and chemistry and biology originally is a better fit, I'm arguing, with the social and natural world, with the way society works, in the same way that Taoism is. So that's the ontological connection. Then the knowing connection, the epistemological connection, is really saying that if you want to know, and this is Brian Goodwin's point about health, for example, you have to use a mixture of the hard and the soft, the subjective and the objective, the qualitative and the quantitative. So that in that sense, it changes your knowing of the social world, becomes something that can't just be pinned down to data and analysis and facts in quite that way. So that's what I mean by science. But one of the things I think people use Taoism to mean, I find I pick up this, is I'm not just saying everything flows or go with the flow. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have to co-create the future flow. We both have to step into it, and then we're co-creating it. So it's quite active. And it's not saying there's no leadership, for example, or it's not saying, if I join an organization with this idea of getting in the flow, I've got to understand the hard structures in the organization as well as the informal structures. And then I've got to work out how things actually happen, as opposed to how people pretend they happen or hope they happen. But it has a hard-edged element to it. And it's I certainly would, in my work, be saying, well, that's something we can measure. What's the population density? What's the rate of change of population increase? How many people have fallen over in this hospital? There's nothing. This is not just going, I'm going to meditate and go with the flow and see what happens. But that is sometimes how it can be characterized that way.
Yes, and it's definitely not that. It's understanding that you can have these patterns that are shared, and these things can be very different and very needed in different situations at different times. That's a hard thing for people to hold, but I feel like that's the future, right? Or if we're going to have a future.
Yeah, and also it's like if I came along to your family and said, I've analysed your family and it follows this, it's this sort of family, and here's your pack, and you just need to do these things, and then everything will be perfect. You laugh at me. Whereas, an organisation or a community is only a big family. So there's something we can learn. I can say, well, how did this town transform itself? Oh, I can learn from that, but we're a bit different because we've had this history. So it creates a different set of questions to ask, I think, in working. I think a lot of working with in a more complex way is asking questions rather than coming out with this is the answer to your situation.
Yes, and you use the word making a lot, and you just brought it up that it's a participatory and engaged activity. I think that's an important aspect too that you really bring up in the book, and that also relates to what you're saying. It's not just let go and flow.
No, it isn't. No, in my view.
But in the book, you seem to have a larger, I won't say purpose, but this does seem motivated by care and love, and it is about making new waves. And before we go, maybe we could just speak a bit about love, what that word means to you, or care, and if you see that as how that motivates you, or what part that plays in your work.
Well, I've perhaps touched on it a little bit. If you take the view that things are connected, that in some sense, not immediately, but there's a kind of, we're a bit like ripples on an ocean. There's a kind of connectivity. Then then what I do is part of the whole, is co-creating the future with this idea of process. So therefore it matters what I do. It might feel it doesn't matter, but actually you know, we never know, as I was saying earlier, whether we're playing a big part or a little part. Or, you know, sometimes people have come up to me, I'm sure they have with your podcast, you know, years later, and say, what you said there really changed my mind. You know, that really got me. And you probably don't even remember saying it, you know, but you never know. But we are weaving together in this kind of interdependent way what the future is, which is, you know, a Buddhist view, a Taoist view, and I think comes out of this kind of complexity science. So it both matters that I care about things, um, unless, you know, I just want to win. You know, there are, we can point to people in this world who say, I don't care. I don't care about the future. I don't care about people. You know, you have resources I want. I want to win. I want to be the biggest president there's ever been, or, you know, whatever it is. So it you know, you can contravene this, but you will get something that in the end is much less resilient, and certainly plays havoc with, you know, plays Russian roulette with the future. So I don't want to do that. I don't. Somebody was asking me, you know, how did I find it difficult to have values, or what my values would be? And it's like, well, no, not really. You know, I want there to be a sustainable, just, resilient future, for life on Earth. You know, and in order to do that, I have to care about it. And if I just care about making more money, or winning this argument, or, you know, having more power, that's not going to work. And you know, we're all going to die, and I don't take that with me. You know, my legacy is feels much more, I feel much more pleased if I were to have a legacy where I did my own little bit, my own bit of activism, which might be speaking and writing, to you know, to help us do the best we can, even with things not being in a great state in a variety of ways, you know, to help that, help the future, help us to have a future. And so that's what love means to me. And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think through, you know, through cultivating myself in or trying to, in a variety of ways, compassion becomes more embodied for me than an idea. It becomes easier. It isn't like I'm having to decide whether that's in my best interest. It's like love flows, I suppose. Your heart opens. And I think that can be something you cultivate or not. You can guard your heart and make yourself feel safe, or distance, or be greedy, or you can do the opposite. So I think it's a good word. And you know, if we can cultivate love, many of the atrocities that we see happening, and the selfishnesses, would become harder to perpetrate.
And I think in the same way you've been saying that it's not just some kind of passive thing, that we actually make love and we make
Yeah.
meaning, and it is all of the stuff we've been talking about. It's not, you know, it's not just some easy thing
No,
to do.
no, it's also, you know, it's about, I was talking to somebody earlier today about um, being being a bit mindless, with someone, where I'd edited something and not really, I did it very quickly. I wasn't really thinking about it, and it had quite an impact on the person for a variety of reasons. And I felt terrible. I thought, well, that was awful of me. You know, I was doing it quickly. I'm just so used to words. It doesn't hurt me if people alter my words. It doesn't matter. For him, it was like a huge, it really upset him for a variety of reasons. And I had to face up to the fact, well, my lack of thought, and my sort of quite casualness about that, had been hurtful. And, you know, yeah. So you have to face, yes, I'm rambling a bit here, I think, but you have
No,
to,
actually, I'm really glad you said that. That's actually very helpful,
face,
because
yeah, you have
it's
to face up to yourself. Yeah.
yeah, and it's there's two things there. One is that we were talking about, this is a constant practice, and this paying attention, because we
Yeah.
don't really realize our own habits, and we
No,
don't realize the way others see those. So for you just being direct, and yeah, this paying attention, but just going with it, could obviously for the student it means something else, but it can be very hard in the moment to
Yes.
realize this, to pay attention, to think about all of that when you have a million other things you need to be doing. But that is the practice, isn't it? Just
Yes, and sometimes noticing. I was saying to this person, because I'd had an incident with a neighbour about wanting them to cut their tree shorter, and they didn't want to. And I can be really persistent. I don't give up easily, which is a good thing sometimes. I keep going, and other times it isn't. And she said to me, "Well, maybe the tree mattered to them." And it's like I'm so into, well, it's too, it's cutting my light, and it's like I don't. If you put yourself in the other position, you go, "Oh yes, well maybe they do feel differently about the tree." Then you can you could be more relational in it. And it's this split sometimes between this is logical. Your tree's too high. I've got right on my side. Cut your tree down. Doesn't get you anywhere. But it's when you see that, you think, oh dear, I here I am again, with up on a trying to trying to make something happen, which, in a different context, it's all about context, is something that's good. I will stand my ground sometimes when, or keep pushing. But it is a
yeah,
practice, and it's paradoxical and complex. There's not one right answer.
yes,
It depends on the situation, but it's being, some people go, oh, I can't be bothered with that. But through that minutiae, and I think this is something that Prigoghine's sort of complexity emphasizes, it's the minutiae, it's sometimes the subtleness that actually creates the shift
mhm.
in society, or in the change in the community. It's not the logical big thing. It's the moment that matters. Sometimes things really matter.
Yes, and I think these small things, like what you're talking about, I know you said you think you're rambling, but actually I think this is incredibly important because it is these small moments that actually do make big changes. And
Yeah,
someone understanding, just hearing you say that you could take take in the situation, either the tree or the student thing differently, just being able
mm,
to hold that, I think, can
yeah,
help people because we do often think we're either right or wrong, or
yeah,
we have to defend our, no, I'm right about the tree, or, well,
yeah,
he should just be tougher. He's just got to deal with criticism.
yeah,
Sometimes people go into those roles just because we do have this either or
yes,
kind of reaction. So,
mm,
and a lot of what you're writing in the book about that process is helping us hold that space long enough to not take it personally and just say, "Oh, yeah, maybe they do care about the tree."
yes,
That's a very small thing, but I would say it actually, once you can do that, adds to your quality of life immeasurably. If you can
yeah,
be okay with yourself to do that, would you
yeah,
agree?
yes, yes, no, 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 definitely. And if if we're all, in a variety of ways, and all the people, I was all not all the people, but these kind of complex scientific worldviews, for many people are trying to make the world a better place. But it is this kind of, right brain, more interwoven view that helps you to do that well. It's marrying the two always. So there are facts, and I'm not denying that. And but it's how do you cultivate both at the same time? Some of the developmental models that it's why I don't like to think of complexity as a thinking practice. I think being able to embrace complexity, it requires a kind of bigger perspective. It's kind of looking wider and longer, being able to integrate disparate ideas. It's being able to hold the heart and the mind together. It's I'm not saying we've all got to be able to do that all the time, but that is what we're aiming for. And it holds up that vision for us. Whereas often in organizations we go, just do what you're told, just fill in this form, this is the best method, teach this way, we'll measure your success in this way. So we kind of dumb down people into a kind of mechanical process, and they leave their humanity at the door, and do all these kind of slightly meaningless tasks and then go back. Whereas this vision of a more, relational, complex, heart mind sort of world, is something that can aspire us to move towards them, I think, and is more like the world is. It creates greater effectiveness if we embrace complexity, not by just going it's complex, but by understanding the nature of that complexity, this idea of patterning and paradox and flow. It equips me with a different kind of frame in which to hone my behaviors in, to be effective in the world.
Yes, and I do think that is that space of feeling the compassion that you were talking about, where you do start to live in a different way, and it can be hard to put that into words or explain. It can also be hard not to see someone being a bully who's in a place of power and think that's the way you have to always do it. But when you're actually living as the bully, it's not a very nice reality. It's nothing like living in that place of compassion, but you can only know it if you experience it. And sometimes the optics confuse us, don't they?
Yeah, definitely.
Did you have any experience of love or anything about love that you would like to share with anyone? Um, Anything that comes to mind? Or you brought up your parents a few times, and I don't know if I really followed through on that, but just anything about any experience of love that.
I think sometimes there can be tiny little acts of kindness that make such a difference to people. So it's not always in the big. It's sometimes. I remember a story somebody once told me about a little boy at a concert, and his parents were kind of getting cross with him because he was not really enjoying it, fidgeting, and they were being quite strict with him and so on. And my friend was sitting apparently behind him, and he was looking quite lost. He obviously wasn't very happy. There was a lot of criticism, and she started making faces at him and made him laugh. And you can see that as a little act of resistance to the over dominance or control of his parents. He just was seen by her in that moment. And I can think of tiny moments like that in my life where something's really, somebody's noticed something or responded to something in me that I hardly knew was there, but made all the difference. So I think love can be in the cracks as well as just some sort of big idea, and can make all the difference.
Yeah, I think actually it is in the cracks. When I look back too, sometimes the love might be someone at the supermarket who happened to notice something and say something which you remember for the rest of your life, even though you'll never see those people again.
Yes, completely. Yeah.
Well, Jean, it's just been wonderful, and I love your book, and there's so much in there that we didn't get to, of course, but I appreciate you sharing this time with me, and I appreciate your book. Is there anything before we go that you want to add or say? Or
No, I've enjoyed talking about it. It's vulnerable making, because if you're prepared to share who you really are, it's it's a big thing. And thank you for the kind of questions you've asked and how you've held it. You've made it very easy to open up and talk about these things, and I feel like I've been able to express my truth in a way. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
thank you for saying that, and thank you for going there with me, because I am sure that someone will hear it and need it somewhere, and even if it's only one person, as we've been talking about,
Yeah.
more love gets in through the cracks. So,
Yeah.
and thank you for everything.
Okay, thank you.
All right, be well.